So the combat beta actually came out a few days ago, but I wanted to take my time and collect my thoughts on this combat beta before making my initial impressions of the first round of said combat beta. And I don't think we need to beat around the bush, so let's just go ahead and get right into this video. So for starters, those who don't know, the combat triangle is going over some serious changes. As you can see here, my action bar looks kind of different. We have these things called attack or magic or ranged, and essentially they're just auto attacks for the style. It's like the first thing you get, and those aren't in the main game. Well, this is a combat beta aimed at making the game easier to learn for early and mid-game players, and I'll get into the specifics later on what I think about that and how they're approaching it. But right now I'm just going to go through what I've tested so far, what I've played with, and give you my thoughts on like how the styles feel right now and all that stuff. But the very first thing that I went and tested was ability stalling. Ability stalling, I have said for the longest time in private chats or Discord calls with friends, or even on stream over on Twitch, other people's stream chats, basically anyone who is willing to listen or isn't willing to listen, but I'm going to scream it anyways. Stalling is not a game mechanics issue, it is a UX/UI issue. And the first good news that I have here in this combat beta is a lot of that has been solved. Before, stalling required releasing something like smoke cloud or some other spell in order to release the stall that you had, where if I want to stall something and hold the ability, I'll have it, and if I just click the target again, it still works as usual, and I can do something like stall an attack and then release it with another ability without a global cooldown being incurred on the first one. But if I want to stall something on a target like this and release it on something else, you just click the target and it releases. Now, I assume most people watching this channel already have a relatively basic grasp, or some of you definitely have very detailed knowledge bases on what ability stalling is. But for those who have no idea, all ability stalling is saving an ability for later. It is not a specific time window in which you do this. It's not just a wars pre-build. Stalling is the simple act of literally saving an ability for later on. So say I want to attack something like that target over there. Well, melee can't, like, I can't just take my sword and throw it into the goblin, as funny as that might be. But what I can do is click on the target and then hit an ability, and then once I come into attack range, then I use said ability. And since I had pressed it earlier, the global cooldown had already started, so by the time I get there, if I wanted to, I could immediately press another ability, and essentially it allows you to do hit and run tactics is what I like to call them, or with melee specifically, you're kind of running around dealing with mechanics, but you're not losing any DPM or damage per minute because you're still getting all of the abilities out in the time that they would normally get out when you're just standing next to a target pressing buttons. So already this combat beta is significantly better than that ranged one that we had where we couldn't do anything with stalling. Also, real quick, if you stall something and then just target cycle to another thing, it releases the stall automatically with target cycle. So that's something that's really nice. But what I would like to see is for the keybind sake, but the reason I want to see a keybind for that is releasing something automatically on target cycle might cause some issues down the road, so I'd like an extra option in order to keybind something. But I would definitely keep the way it is right now standard for the player and have an option for us advanced players who want to do some technical stuff to have that backup option. But for the default player or the standard player, the new guy so to speak, it just works as normal, and then it's something they can learn well on down the road. So yeah, I like how stalling works in the beta. I think it works nicely. I think it's a lot more friendly for anyone trying to learn it. Now, something that is going to come out in the next update for this combat beta is a visual cue on your character somewhere, I guess like some type of glow or something like that. That is a visual indicator you have an ability stalled. And I guess wherever the little channeled thing is, the little indicator that tells you when you're channeling an ability and it shows the game ticks as it's filling out, my guess is also in that window or next to it or something like that, it's going to show you which ability you have stalled. Again, I think that's fantastic and definitely something that should be added, but even just the base version as it here is in this beta is perfectly fine with me. Now we can get into the combat styles, and there is a bit of critiquing here, although I don't think I'm gonna say anything that really hasn't been said or detailed out already, but I'll provide the insight that I have into these ideas. And in the beta as it currently sits, melee feels extremely neutered as a combat style. It feels very underwhelming. If you look over here, there are 16 abilities total. That's it for attack and strength. So if you're like me and you never like pressing bleeds because ever since they changed Easy K, your spear doesn't have any perks, and you have dive somewhere else, you can fit the entire action bar out with melee abilities, which I can see the logic in of not requiring different bars for dual wield and two-handed swaps. But I personally think melee should at least have a few more abilities. This feels really naked, honestly. I'd say one more solid basic back in the mix somewhere, and I would really like to see Destroy come back. Threshold stuns have really good use cases on older bosses, specifically something like Telos. Destroy is very nice, especially when you're bleeding Destroy. It has some very nice use cases on that. So Destroy is a threshold I would like to see return, and just some other basic. Meteor Strike is pretty underwhelming. They changed it to where all of the adrenaline buffing ultimates are now restricted to their own combat styles. However, the adrenaline cost is significantly down, so in practice, it doesn't feel as bad as trying to get a meteor then build back up for your Zerk, because it's only 40%. So usually you can fit this in the window of you Zerk, you barge, you do your two abilities, and on that second ability you press Meteor Strike, then bleed your assault. It fits in that window, but the adren gain feels pretty weak, even though it is what would that be, about 150% adren in total from all of the benefits factored in over 30 seconds. I think that Meteor Strike, either the adren per tick needs to go up, maybe the basic multiplier needs to go up, something needs to be worked there. But if we're going to be locking adrenaline buffing ultimates to their own combat styles, the duration definitely needs to be improved. That was the entire nice thing of doing off-style crit buffs in the first place, is that through some form of skill expression, you were able to continuously be under a very generous adrenaline buff. And right now it feels like as soon as you go outside of your Zerk and Meteor Strike wears off, it just falls flat on its face and you're just kind of left building up with a auto attack and maybe another basic or two. So I would say this duration needs to go to, I would say 45 seconds would be a good duration, and that would also help out with hybrid, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Also, assault being a 6-second cooldown, I don't really see being a good idea. I guess the idea is in the early game you just build up basics and then press assault, but I also think that could be kind of a noob trap, because it just reinforces the muscle memory of spam a couple buttons, press a threshold, and never do anything else. But that point could be argued against with saying that it's making a mountain out of a molehill. But personally, I don't think teaching someone bad muscle memory off the bat is a good idea. The initial muscle memory you learn from doing any sort of activity, not just playing RuneScape, is extremely important to cultivate in a positive manner in which you can build up on. That's why you always hear people talking about building on fundamentals and learning fundamentals of something, whether it's a skill set in gaming, like doing aim training or something like that, whether it's like playing a musical instrument, whether it's learning a new sport, a new hobby. It doesn't matter what it is. If it has any sort of skill set to it, learning the the fundamentals is the most important thing, and you build off of those. Which leads me into the next combat style, which I'm just going to use magic as an example. Now, I don't have the basic attack on my bar. Luckily, magic didn't really lose any abilities. Combust became a threshold, which feels like absolute garbage, but it is what it is. I won't dwell on it for too long, but it needs to not be a threshold. That's just a bad idea. So if I just go ahead and start spamming this magic basic, I just pulled it out from over there, but if I just go ahead and start spamming it on a target like this, the global cooldown is every 2 ticks, and that's because they're trying to keep weapon speed as a thing, and this is not the right way to go about this, in my opinion. Anything that deviates from the 3-tick global cooldown is going to not be good for anyone building muscle memory, especially an early game player who, say they just happen to pick dual wield over 2-hand, they have a 50-50 shot of learning a global cooldown rhythm that is not conducive to anything in the mid or end game. And they're going to have to unlearn that 2-tick global cooldown in order to actually do the combat system later on in the game with any sort of efficiency. This reminds me when they tried to do that weapon diversity beta. This is a long time ago. I want to say this was like 2019 or 2018. It may be even earlier than that. And knives had a 2-tick global cooldown instead of a 3-tick global cooldown, and it just became an absolute cluster trying to keep up with that. But what I would do for these on the weapon speed front is, if there's a creative idea that the devs have, go ahead and send that, get rid of 2-tick global cooldown on anything. And personally, I would just can weapon speed at this point. I don't think it really matters, because we don't have auto attacks anymore. We just have a basic attack. The only other 2-tick ability I can think of is this new Gale's Imbue. This one is a 1.2 second global cooldown, or 2-tick global cooldown. In practice, it felt very bad to use, not only because it was 2-tick, but also they're playing with these ideas of Imbue where you don't do any damage, you apply a self buff, and then it buffs up something else. And I will say, all of the imbues in practice, whenever I tried using them, they just felt bad. Even if I know that mathematically they are worthwhile to press and they will buff up something else and it's something you want to press, pressing a button that doesn't generate or take away any adrenaline and doesn't apply any damage to anything, in my opinion, feels very bad to use, as it breaks up that flow of combat, so to speak, where you're pressing buttons, you're seeing the damage you're doing. There's like a certain flow state you get into with your rotation. And anytime I pressed any of these imbues, whether it be Gales or Shadows, it just didn't feel right to me. Something felt very off, and I did not like the pause in rhythm, so to speak. I made a similar complaint in the first beta video where they were doing a splinter shot, and it was like this imbue type thing where you do a set and forget. I don't like set and forgets, and this is probably a better explanation on why I don't like them. Is you set a buff on yourself and just see nothing happen, no like actual visual, like yeah, there's like a little visual here, but it doesn't feel right to me. It breaks up the flow of combat, and I'm probably gonna ramble on this if I don't stop myself, so we'll just move on. The rest of ranged felt okay. I'm still not sure why snipe is a 1-minute cooldown and does an insane amount of damage. I think a basic ability should be grouped roughly similar to other basics. Also, the fact that it doesn't generate adrenaline doesn't feel good. That's another thing that I don't like in this beta, in just a general sense, is abilities, in my opinion, should definitely either give or take adrenaline. I don't really care what the amounts are so much, but seeing in my peripheral vision that my adrenaline bar is moving is a good visual indicator to seeing something has happened, or see that I've actually pressed said ability, because I'll usually be looking at my character, or I will look at my action bar, and I do pay attention to my adrenaline. I'm kind of going between all three. Like I'll be focused on the character, look down for a little bit, and then go back. And abilities that don't give or take adrenaline just don't feel that nice to use. I didn't like some of the necromancy abilities for this reason. It's like, in my opinion, just pick one or the other and balance around it. The rest of the range abilities felt fine. Bombardment is still absolutely useless. It is still extremely weak, and it needs like either a giant size increase or a massive damage increase or something. Like, it needs something. And yes, I understand, okay, 36 range, maybe this is like your early game. It still feels bad as a 3x3. I think it should be buffed to 5x5, and maybe there's a discussion there of chins should also be buffed to 5x5, but that's a discussion for another time. Everything else though felt pretty good. I did like the idea of just everything on hit giving adrenaline for the imbue shadows, but as I said with Meteor Strike, I would like this to be extended to like 40 or 45 seconds. Range classically can be very adrenaline starved, and crit buffing ultimates, especially off styling with like Nami, really helps fill the gaps of this ability. It is a very adrenaline hungry combat style with all of its EOFs and whatnot, and unless they plan on just deleting EOFs or something like that in the near future, I don't see that really changing with the combat style. So I definitely would increase this to like 45-second duration. I did already kind of go over magic, but it was more so to give the 2-tick example. Magic itself felt really good, and that's because to me it felt almost the same. It felt very similar to the main game. They did this thing called Runic Charge, which is another self buff, another imbue type thing. I don't hate this one as much because all it does is it works for the next ability, and it feels like almost a preparatory for your sun, so it doesn't feel as bad, but I'd still rather see it do something, whether it be adrenaline or damage or both, even if it's only like 1% adrenaline or 5% or something like that, and it hits like a 1.5k, essentially turning itself into like a more commonly pressed chaos roar. But using this before Sonic Wave and going into a Sunshine, I think you end on like 70 or 90%. It's something insanely high, and Tsunami is basically the same thing. It is the same exact ability. They didn't change anything about Tsunami. It lasts for 30 seconds. It's the same crit adrenaline buff that you get. That's fine. That's nice. Again, if they're going to lock it to style specific where only magic is able to benefit from it, I'd like to see the duration extended, because doing styles outside of an adrenaline buffing alt feels pretty bad, because you go from having a lot of adrenaline to just absolutely nothing at all. That's why I like hybrid so much, because it's just constantly on the up and up. You're always having adren, you're always doing damage, but I digress. And maybe they could do something where Insight Fear is decoupled from Tsunami, so Tsunami is just 40% cost just like all the others, so at least there's some synergy when swapping between styles for people learning. They can remember, okay, this adren ability only cost 40%, instead of having to remember to do Insight Fear stacks. And then you could set it up to where, like, say Insight Fear is like your AoE spell and exsanguinates your single target spell. I think a system like that could work out pretty nicely. And overall, I think this combat beta was a decent starting point for what it was, which was a combat beta where they needed to establish a baseline in order to implement rapid prototyping and do weekly updates, which I think we're getting a beta update on Thursday. Hopefully it's Thursday, so it's like kind of like a once a week thing where they take all the changes, implement them, and go from there. And a lot of this stuff that I've talked about, I've seen it in multiple other places. I don't think I'm really adding anything like new or groundbreaking for in terms of feedback and whatnot, but maybe some of my logic and reasoning behind it is slightly different than those. So it just be what it be. Those are my thoughts on this initial beta so far. I'm definitely going to wait for the next iteration of the beta before I really start digging into rotations and finding and discussing what I do and don't like about the rotations themselves. This seemed to be very much just a broad stroke foundation to, again, do some rapid prototyping and just do some wild changes. But that's all I really have to say on that.